lining up all the speakers for this current gardening season or for 2016. And we're fortunate to have Scott Steward here as our last speaker of the year. Scott Steward is the director of the Lurie Garden in Chicago's Millennium Park, and he is also the acting executive director of the Millennium Park Foundation. For nearly 10 years, Scott has been working in public space management, where he has been able to use his background in ecological thinking and restoration and his love of public spaces to create and improve all these lovely places that we like to visit. So without further ado, I would introduce Dr. Stewart.
Thank you all for having me out today to talk to you a little bit about Lurie Garden, a little bit of the philosophy and such, but we'll get into that in just a moment. I do want to take just a couple of minutes to just introduce myself a little more broadly, because I am a little bit of an oddball in the world of gardening, in the world of horticulture. I have a couple of letters after my name, which, that means pilot higher and deeper, which is exactly what I did for several years. But I'm an ecologist by training, a restoration ecologist by training. Started here in Illinois, did a lot of work in the southeastern U.S. and Florida in particular, and found my way back to Illinois. But I found myself in the world of horticulture through the world of restoration ecology, because I often found myself setting between two worlds. So we would have, as ecologists, 10, 15, 20,000 acres of land to restore. And we'd have all of these wonderful ecological models about how water and carbon and all these things would move through this newly restored system. But when it came down to it, the moment was, or the decision was, we need X millions of plants to put into this environment to make this work as we have it on a piece of paper. And then we'd go talk to horticulturists, we'd talk to gardeners, we'd talk to growers of those plants in the commercial industry. And we realized we weren't speaking the same language. We'd be talking about genetic fidelity of plants and collection radii and all of these ecological concepts. And the horticulturalists, the growers, would be saying, well, I grow plants. I can grow 10,000 of those or 20,000 of these or however many you need, but I don't understand all of this other ecological stuff that you're talking about. So I found myself, because I've always had a lifelong interest in gardening, I found myself sitting between these two worlds, understanding both sides of those worlds, and translating back and forth quite often. And then sort of coupled with sort of falling in love with public spaces, small, large, whatever public spaces, falling in love with the philosophy and the concepts behind what a public space means for urban or suburban or rural settings, and how those spaces are used, and the artistic and architectural and cultural aspects that are so nicely reflected often in our public spaces, and how that works with landscape and gardening and planting. Falling in love with these concepts, I found a natural fit in bringing my interests in ecology and ecological background and management to public spaces, because, let's face it, we all use public spaces, and we all want those public spaces to look pretty, to function nicely, and to be safe spaces to have our families, have our ourselves, have our events in. So I found myself in that world, and then where that led me was where I'm at now, is Lurie Garden. I think Lurie Garden is a perfect example of that blending of the beauty, the artistry, and sort of the gardening side, the landscape side of public spaces, with those concepts of ecological responsibility and environmental stewardship and public education about natural world. I think it's a beautiful sort of marriage of those two ideas right in Lurie Garden. So today what we're going to talk about is, so I used to be a teacher, so I can't ever start a presentation without like an outline. So I taught horticulture in the community college world for about 5 years. So, and I still find myself, I haven't taught in a formal sense in years, but I still find myself in, well, we need an outline for today. And so we have an outline for today. We're going to talk a little bit about sort of the philosophy from an ecological perspective, the philosophy of Lurie Garden, this idea of ecology for landscape design. So how did the idea, the notion of Lurie Garden, and this thing we call mixed perennial plant communities, and How did this idea of using perennials in a naturalistic sense, but not in a pure ecological restoration sense? How did this idea come to be, and what is the sort of history behind that? We're going to talk a little bit about becoming Lurie Garden, the history of Lurie Garden. We're going to wrap that up by talking about what I think is the most interesting piece of Lurie Garden, which is not so much the beauty of the garden, but how the garden is managed. A little peek behind the curtain of Lurie Garden, so to say. All right, so I've already talked about myself as an ecologist. So this is what I used to do. Like down in Florida, instead of weeding the garden, we cut down trees and light the garden on fire to clear out whatever we didn't want. That's how I used to garden. That was my garden. Not so much today, but these same principles and practices that were applied on an ecological or an ecosystem level, they're still applicable to the 5 acres of Lurie Garden, or even the few hundred square feet you may have in a given yard or in a given space. Right? The same principles are at play, and we're going to talk a little bit about those principles. So for a lot of us in the world of gardening, in the world of horticulture, this is what we're accustomed to, sort of traditional ornamental planting. This comes from a visit I made not terribly long ago out to, where was this? Totally just escaped my mind now. But this is what we think of as a traditional horticultural ornamental planting. Harkens back to that idea of very traditional European, formal, clean lines, interesting shapes, highly manicured, and to be honest, high input gardening. A lot of time, a lot of effort. This is what a lot of people are very comfortable with, particularly when you're talking about public spaces. When you have to go before a park board or some commission or something to get approval for a particular planting, this is what most of those individuals feel comfortable with. Not what you might see in a Lurie Garden, not what you might actually see right out here on the dunes. It is much more comfortable to a lot of people to see this type of traditional ornamental planting. However, there is an alternative. In this traditional ornamental planting, we have this very simple but classic idea of I will put a plant here and I'll move over 18 inches, and I'll put another plant here and I'll move over 18 inches, and I'll put another plant here in these nice straight lines. Maybe get a little wild and do a little curving sweep or something with those plants. You know, a little mass planting of all the same species. You know, get really crazy and do that. Maybe have plants touching each other. That's really frightening for people sometimes. You know, and then what do we do in between our plants? Because soil looks ugly. We put wonderful fields of mulch. Wonderful fields of mulch. And as we all know from basic biology, plants have evolved very well to grow in wood. So we know they love growing in wood. You know, so that's what we traditionally do. And this is what our landscapes look like. This is really what a lot of them look like. Nothing wrong with it. It works. You know, there's nothing wrong with it. It's work, and it's very comfortable with people. There are alternatives, though. So, and I'm a big fan of the alternatives. So, what can we learn when we look at our gardens versus we look at wild systems? We look at natural communities, wild communities. You know, our gardens don't look like this. Right? There's species composition, mixtures of plant materials out here. Not high diversity of plants necessarily, but there's mixtures and combinations of plant materials here in this, in essence, natural system. What can we learn from looking at these natural systems? This is a natural system in northern Minnesota, a river and forest system. What can we learn about plant combinations, plant types, and plant orientations and design? What can we do when we look at prairies? What can we learn about density of plant materials in prairies? And if you've ever taken the time, or if you haven't, I encourage you to take the time. Go to a reasonably either well-restored or sort of a natural prairie, a naturally occurring prairie, and dig down into plant material. What you'll find is that down at the base of all of the plants, down on the ground level, it's actually very densely packed with plant material. All these grasses emerge up out of that, but then underneath all those grasses, or in this matrix near the ground, are all these other smaller, lower growing plants. They find just enough sunlight to grow. But that's one of the reasons prairies don't have weeds, is because all of those little spaces are occupied. All those little soil spaces are occupied. So there's not a place for a weed to really take root, so to say. Right? That's a lesson we can learn in designing and thinking about our own gardens. We can even go as far out into the Pacific Northwest and learn from a mountain habitat, learn from a montane habitat. What can we learn about planting design, plant diversity, plant spacing? What can we learn from these natural communities? Go back down into the southeastern U.S. and we have these savannas and these forested floodplains and forested wetlands. What can we learn from these natural communities about how plants coexist, how plant communities develop, and how can we transfer that knowledge into our gardens? Rather than creating the gardens more or less as an engineer may create them, on a piece of paper, very neat, orderly lines, what can we learn from the wild world that makes our gardens even better? Okay? So it's this idea of taking a traditional horticultural planting, and I should back up for just a moment and say, I'm not a landscape architect, I'm not a garden designer. If I designed a garden, it probably would look like that. You know, there's nothing wrong with it, but it would probably look like that. I'm not a great garden designer, which is always odd. A lot of people, I say that, and a lot of people are like, but you were director of Lurie Garden. You're not a garden designer? No, absolutely not. We have other people that do that, and they're really talented. And I do my best to stay out of their way. And they tell me what they need to have happen, and I try to make that happen. Otherwise, I try to stay out of their way. So we have to take a traditional horticultural planting, where we like to use mulch, where we like to evenly space plants around, and combine that with a natural plant community. What can we learn from the natural world into this idea called a designed plant community or a mixed perennial plant community? Right? And this is very much the design concept or philosophy behind a place like Lurie Garden. And a number of other places. This is not exclusive. This thinking is not exclusive to Lurie Garden. There are a number of other gardens. I think Lurie Garden is one of the best examples on the planet for this, and it is certainly one of the best documented examples of this type of thinking. But Lurie Garden is a good example of taking traditional horticultural plantings and practices, combining them with natural plant community dynamics, understanding of natural plant communities, inspiration from wild native or wild natural communities, and placing them into a setting, combining them, and placing them into a setting to create this designed plant community or this mixed perennial plant community. The idea behind this designed plant community or this mixed perennial plant community is not to mimic nature. That is the world of the restoration ecologist. They are trying to copy or recreate nature. We, as people interested in gardening, as people interested in designed plant communities, we are interested in interpreting and amplifying nature. So what lessons can we learn from a grass-dominated dune community? How can we then amplify the beauty that we see out here to bring this into our gardens, but not imitate that beauty, not imitate that natural community, right? So a good example of that is in a public space. Oftentimes you have these large, open, sunny areas, right? They're typically people gathering spaces, but more or less, over time you learn that people, this may be a 10-acre field, but people only gather in certain areas. And 95% of it is underutilized by people. So you have this open, sunny space that we're paying to mow, that we're paying to maintain, maybe keep weed-free, those types of things. If we look at nature and open, sunny spaces in nature and interpret those spaces, amplify those spaces for beauty, for aesthetic purposes, for landscape design purposes, we can look to meadows and prairies and see the inherent beauty in meadows and prairies. You're not mowing them. There's blooming plant material. There's beautiful plant materials. It's not always just about the flower. It's also about leaves. It's also about stem colors, all of these other wonderful pieces of the plant. It's about taking a prairie and meadow community and building it into an open, sunny field in a public space where you still have maybe some turf grass areas for people to gather for picnics or concerts and such, but then you have areas that are otherwise underutilized by people in this beautiful, relatively low maintenance prairie or meadow type community. And then you're amplifying that prairie or meadow type community to have more color, to have more vibrancy, to attract more insects, to attract more birds, to attract more wildlife, whatever that is. You're amplifying that because you're in a public space and you want the opportunity to bring people and plants and nature all together in that space. That's the idea behind this design plant community concept. Looking at a heavy shade area. You have a very heavy shaded area in a lawn or a very heavy shaded area in a public space. You can look to the forest community. And actually this park is a wonderful example of that. All of the spaces that you have throughout the central portion of this park that more or less are not mowed, they're forested, and they're allowed to sort of generate onto themselves. They're allowed to be themselves. That's a perfect example of looking to a forest community to modify how we might otherwise have a public space. Because I can also find very easily any number of public parks that have heavily shaded forested areas, much like this park does, but then they're trying to grow turf grass underneath it. Central Park in New York has a lot of these spaces. They have a lot of wonderfully sort of naturalistic communities as well, but they have a lot of spaces that no one ever goes that are under dense canopies and they're trying to grow turf grass underneath there. We all have seen parks like this, but there's an opportunity as someone interested in perennial plant communities, in this perennial mixed community concept, to look to a forest community, interpret and amplify that community for aesthetics, for beauty, but not imitate it. Right? So what's nice about that not imitating part is a lot of times you remove the messy nature, because you're turning it into a garden space. So you remove the messy nature that a lot of park boards, a lot of park districts, a lot of political individuals, people who have to sign off on these types of projects. You eliminate the weediness, the messiness that is often associated in people's minds with a naturalistic design perspective. So it's a very powerful tool, understanding and this is where Lurie Garden, the design concept for Lurie Garden really came. It's a very powerful tool, highly underutilized in public spaces. Lurie Garden is 13 years old. We're entering our 13th year. In 13 years, you can still count on basically two hands the number of public lands, number of public spaces that have adopted this same design philosophy. It's slowly beginning to catch on, but it's still incredibly limited. I'm always a little disappointed with that, because how rare is it occasionally to have basically a whole landscape design concept come out of the Midwestern U.S. and be something that is could be so wildly popular. Normally things like this come out of a place like in New York or London or Paris or something like that. It doesn't come out of Chicago. It doesn't come out of the Midwestern U.S. It is starting to catch on more and more. The Lurie Garden was one of the first gardens of this type in the U.S. It subsequently went on to inspire the High Line, which has subsequently gone on to inspire a new Pete Uloff designed meadow at the brand new Delaware Botanical Gardens. There's other projects that are in the works that are going to be bringing this same type of design style, same type of design philosophy to the U.S. more and more. So it is something that's become very, very popular. And then, as I said, I think one of the best examples of this idea of design plant communities or mixed perennial plant communities is the Lurie Garden. So here you're looking across the west side of Lurie Garden. It's called the Light Plate, L-I-G-H-T, the Light Plate. At the skyline, this beautiful sort of matrix, this beautiful design of native and non-native plants that are inspired by their placements, their designs, and even their management is inspired by natural areas. But it's not a photocopy of those natural areas. It's an interpretation of a prairie. But it's also amplified because it's a garden. It's a beautifully designed garden space. So it's an interpretation of a prairie. It's meant to make you think, this is something like a prairie. It should feel like it is. But it is certainly not. It's amplified to add additional beauty. Okay, so that's a little bit of the philosophy behind Lurie Garden and this idea of mixed perennial communities and these design plant communities. So let's speak a bit more specifically about Lurie Garden. So becoming Lurie Garden, I'm going to walk you through a very brief history of Lurie Garden. Some of you who are familiar with the garden, familiar with the development of Millennium Park may know of quite a bit of this. There's still, every time I talk about this portion, or a little history of Lurie Garden, I always seem to run across somebody who has another story to add to their experience. They saw Lurie Garden, or they saw Millennium Park being built. So it's wonderful. I think that's one of the great powers of Lurie Garden Millennium Park, is that it's such a popular space. It's such a meaningful space for a lot of people, that a lot of people in the Chicago area had experiences as the park or the garden was being built, early in its history. Before it was being built, it was just simply an idea on paper and in the newspapers and on the news. People connected with it. So every time I give a little bit of history about Lurie Garden, or give one of these presentations, somebody always has another story to add. And I think that's just wonderful, because I'm a sucker and can never say no to things. As my second job at the Millennium Park is acting executive director of Millennium Park Foundation, as that job, now I'm the caretaker of that Millennium Park story. So adding to that story and adding those personal layers to that story of both the park and the Lurie Garden are always just fantastic experiences. Quick timeline of Lurie Garden. August to October of 2000, there was an international competition released for the design of a public garden. It was not called Lurie Garden at that time, but a public garden at the south end of Millennium Park. In October of 2000, Lurie Garden, again, still was not called Lurie Garden at the time, but Lurie Garden was commissioned, and then it was completed 4 years later in June, and opened in June of 2004. The designers that were awarded the commission for Lurie Garden, Gustafson, Guthrie, Nicole, GGN, as the lead landscape architects. And we've developed over the last couple of years a wonderful sort of renewed friendship, a renewed partnership with GGN and their involvement in the garden, and have been learning these wonderfully beautiful stories about their involvement in Lurie Garden. And they tell us a great story about how they were basically a brand new firm. Lurie Garden was the very first public project they ever did as a firm.
Wow.
They were the two of the three principals were fresh out of landscape architecture school, fresh with their licenses. They were working out of an office that had upside down turned garbage cans as office chairs and plywood and cinder block desks. They were that new. And so to be awarded a space that had the vision that Lurie Garden did in 2000 and now has the impact Lurie Garden has now in 2016, 2017, that's pretty amazing. I often like to leap before I look and get into things and figure it out along the way. I don't know if I could have ever taken that kind of risk. That was a pretty amazing risk.
Where are they from?
They're from Seattle, Washington.
Okay.
Yeah, they're based out of Seattle, Washington. They do also have an office in Washington, D.C. Their latest project is they are the landscape architects for the African American History Museum. Yes, that is either just opened or is just about to open. They're the master landscape architects for that. So obviously the success of Lurie Garden has led to great things for GGN. Because GGN, they understood their shortcomings. They knew they were new in the game of landscape architecture and public space design. They were from Seattle and they were not as familiar with the Chicago climate, the Chicago plant palette. They wanted to bring along someone who understood these elements much better. So that's where Pete Ulof from Netherlands got involved. So he got involved as the perennial plant designer for Lurie Garden. Of the 5 acres of Lurie Garden, 2.5 of them are designed by Pete Ulof's perennial plant mixture. A few years after the sort of planting and initial opening, Jacqueline Vanderkloot designed the bulb mixtures that are in the garden right now, and we still to this day are maintaining, not in the strictest sense true to her designs, but certainly her inspired designs. So we're taking her designs and continuing them to this day. And then Robert Israel, who's actually a stage set designer and theater producer, he was part of the team more as the conceptual design process person. Someone to control the sort of the chaos that is created in brainstorming sessions. He helped kind of control that chaos. As I said, the garden is 5 acres, 2.5 of which are perennial plant beds. High plant diversity for a very small footprint. So we have about 222 species selections or cultivars of plants. That doesn't mean that we only have 222 plants. I said that once in a presentation, that we have 222 species or cultivars of plants, and someone immediately raises their hand and says, you only have 222 plants in that whole garden? Like, I can put that in, a couple hundred square feet. No. Just 222 different types of plants across the garden, all right? We do have a very small staff for our footprint again. We have 2 full-time, 3 part-time, 1 to 2 interns a year, and then 65 to 70 or so volunteers. 8, 10 of which, maybe as many as 12 when the season gets really busy, are hands-on out in the garden. The rest of those volunteers help us with weekly tours. So 3 times a week during peak season, we're running tours of the garden. They lead those tours. They also help lead and facilitate some of our programming. So we offer 75 to 100 free public programs each year as part of the garden, and the volunteers assist with that. Now, a lot of people at this point, and then our estimated visitorship is about 3.25 million. And that number, as we've started to get a little bit more scientific about how we collect that information in both the park and the garden, that number is a gross underestimation. We're not quite ready to officially release the big numbers yet, but it's a gross underestimation. Lurie Garden is going to be either the number 1 or the number 2 most visited public garden, botanic garden, or arboretum on the planet. And to put that in perspective, the most visited botanic garden on the planet is Gardens by the Bay, or Gardens of the Bay in Singapore, with 8 million people a year. Yeah. So Lurie Garden will be playing in that same realm very soon. And now a lot of people say, okay, this is a lot of stuff. How do you do all of this stuff? Well, we do all this stuff because we have a wonderful and generous gift from the Ann and Robert H. Lurie Family Foundation of $10 million. It's an endowment that helps us operate the garden. That endowment's restricted to Lurie Garden only, and then the operations and maintenance of the garden. That pays for all of the staff time, that pays for all the plant materials, that pays for all of the supplies and instructors and everything that makes the garden work. And we're able to make that work. We also have a lot of support from the local horticultural industry as well. So a lot of the local growers and such will donate plant material to us quite often. They'll oftentimes donate their time as well in providing instructors and expertise for programs and such as well. All right, so 1929, this is what Lurie Garden Millennium Park looked like. All right, this is Michigan Avenue, this is Monroe, this is the river, the lake is right here. This is Millennium Park. This would be Lurie Garden, right here, where M and O and N are, in Monroe. That's the Art Institute. The modern wing of the Art Institute is now right here. All right, so that's 1929. We were a rail yard. We were basically the end of the line for raw materials coming into Chicago to be manufactured into finished goods, and then the beginning of the line for those finished goods to go back out to the world, either via the railroad or right over here to the lake to be sent out into the world. Move forward a few years, 1952. What is the big transition in Chicago? Well, 2 big transitions in Chicago. One, manufacturing became less of an important concept in Chicago and began to move out to the sort of fringe areas of Chicago, and cars. So what did we need in Chicago? We needed parking lots. So the site where Millennium Park and Lurie Garden is today is more or less here, a little bit of this space as well. You see the Art Institute, Michigan Avenue. This is Columbus here. This was Lakeshore Drive. This would be where Maggie Daly Park is today. This is Millennium Park and Lurie Garden here. So it's a combination of 25 acres worth of parking lot and train yard still in 1952. Roll the clock forward to 1997. The trains are mostly gone, with the exception of Metro Electric that runs to the South Chicago and the South Shore line that runs over here. So still serving the purpose as a rail yard. The parking lot has more fully expanded to take out most all of the freight train lines, and is now fully a parking lot with that commuter rail service. Right? So about this time is when Mayor Daley and his wife Maggie Daley had been doing quite a bit of traveling through the world, and they recognized the thing that makes the great, for instance, cities of Europe great were that they had these wonderful public spaces. They had these wonderful public spaces for people to gather for the art, architecture, and culture of those communities, of those regions to be displayed and to be enjoyed by the masses. Right? And Chicago did not have that, because at the time, Chicago was where you came to work. Chicago got work done. You know, New York, that was where you went to go see a play, where you went to go see art. You know, LA at the time, they made movies out there. That was pretty much it. Chicago's where the world came to work. That very Midwestern ethic of, you know, it's just you really put your nose to the grindstone. Chicago was where the work of the world got done, which made for a bit of a dreary, gritty city. Right? Mayor Daley's vision that included Millennium Park, as well as a lot of the other greening of Chicago that happened under Mayor Daley, was really to create public space in the city of Chicago, to show off, to showcase the best of the arts, architecture, and culture that Chicago had to offer. So, piece of that was going to be Lurie Garden. At the south end of this 24.5 acres of Millennium Park was going to be a public garden that was unlike any public garden on the planet. It was going to be truly and uniquely Chicago. It was going to be truly and uniquely Midwestern. And it was not going to be a photocopy or a reinterpretation of some other public garden somewhere in the world. They didn't want to go to the palace. They didn't want to go to the palaces and the gardens of Versailles and photocopy some of those gardens, add a few Midwestern plants in, and drop it in Millennium Park. They didn't want to go to Kew Garden, photocopy a few of those designs, add a few Midwestern plants, and drop it in the south end of Millennium Park. They wanted something. When I say they, it was a group of design professionals, civic leaders, and cultural critics in Chicago. That group did not want a public garden that was a copy. We wanted to be out in front, as Chicago tends to do. And I think there's a very strong ethic of this in Chicago. If you're an architect and you want to build a skyscraper that kind of pushes the boundaries of design, pushes the boundaries of aesthetic, you can't do that in New York, because there's people that tell you, no, it has to look like this, no, you can't put that on this. And you can't do that in LA, you can't do that in Europe. You come to Chicago and you're able to do that. That's why we have one of the most beautiful skylines in the world. One of the reasons we have some of the most beautiful public spaces in the world is the same concept, the same philosophy. So this space that was going to become Lurie Garden was going to be truly unique. 18 international landscape architects were invited to apply, judged by this group of civic leaders, cultural critics, and such. The group, or the proposal that was awarded the commission was, again, from GGN and Pete Uloff. At the time, it was simply called the Shoulder Garden, evoking the sense of the north and the west shoulder hedge that encloses and creates a bit of oasis in Lurie Garden. It was by far the most fully developed submission. It was by far the most sort of bold and intellectually engaging. And for the space, one of the most cutting-edge designs at the time. And it took into account the fact that in Chicago, we don't care that it snows and that it gets cold outside. You know, other cities just say, all right, we're done for the season, and we close up. Chicago doesn't do that. So this was the only design that incorporated the fact that Chicagoans don't mind going outside in the snow and when it's cold. So this is a true four-season garden. You know, there's beauty in the winter garden, and there's designed into this. So those all combine to create Lurie Garden and to create the commission for Lurie Garden. This is a cover of a book called Constructed Ground. It's a little bit of a rare find anymore. The best place to find one is in the archives at the Harold Washington Library at this point. This is the design story of Lurie Garden. So it includes all of the sort of conceptual sketches from other landscape architects that were submitted that were also considered finalists. It's really fascinating to see, and you can see by looking through there, Dan Kiley, if any of you are familiar with Dan Kiley's work, South Garden at the Art Institute is a Dan Kiley garden, those wonderful sculpted hawthorns and everything. That's one of Dan Kiley's pieces. Well-known, amazingly well-respected landscape architect worldwide, certainly in Chicago, but worldwide. His submission was very Dan Kiley garden, highly formal, you know, very European in a sense. And it was a finalist because his name was Dan Kiley and he was a Chicagoan, but it was nowhere close to being in the running. It absolutely was not. because, again, it was not all of these things that the shoulder garden at the time, and what became Lurie Garden, really were. This is the team that made Lurie Garden happen. This is GGN. This is the design team GGN. This is Pete. And then a lot of you may know this gentleman, Roy Diblick. So Roy grew most all of the plant material for Lurie Garden. He either grew it himself directly at Northwind Perennial Farms, or he worked with people like Midwest Ground Covers and a few other small growers to grow the plant material for Lurie Garden. So the early years of Lurie Garden, this was the team that made it happen. All the way from the first time a pencil touched a piece of paper to create a design, all the way till the last plant being installed and someone walking away and saying, we're done. This was the team that made it happen. 2002, this is what Lurie Garden looked like. If you're familiar with Lurie Garden, you start to see some of the elements, some of the pathways, maintenance path, the seam boardwalk. This is, just to place you, this is Columbus along here. This is Monroe along here. Okay. So this is what Lurie Garden looked like. Obviously the Kretzker Pavilion, BP Bridge. Then in 2002, this is what the garden looked like. Very rapidly, it began to transform. 2003, plants going in the ground. Certain elements still under construction. 2003, plants going in the ground. This is the planting of the Salvia River in Lurie Garden. A lot of people are amazed that that Salvia River was planted in, believe it or not, these are pints. Little tiny pints. So one of the philosophies of this perennial plant community concept is that you plant small and you allow the plant to grow into its space. You allow the plant to adapt into its space. And through that adaptive process, you will find out whether or not a plant is going to survive and get along well with its neighbors and get along well with the environment that it's in, the local environment, the immediate environment, or it's not going to, and then you'll have to go back to the drawing board and select another plant. So one of the reasons that the plantings in Lurie Garden are so vibrant and they're so vigorous is because everything was planted either as pints or 1 gallon containers and allowed to grow into the space and really well adapt to that space. 2004, this is what the garden looked like. Okay. 2004, this is basically, I think this may even be June of 2004. You see very early on some of the plant materials, you can still find in the exact same locations, but obviously here they're a quarter of the size. But this is what the garden looked like when it was first planted. And this is the era of the garden where, with the exception of a handful of architecture and landscape architecture critics, most of them from Chicago, most of them from the Tribune in Chicago, they would walk through all of the other critics from all of the other newspapers, magazines, professional landscape architecture and architecture societies. They would walk through the garden and say, oh boy, get the bulldozers out. And there was only a handful of critics that said, just give it time. This is going to be they could see it. We all as gardeners know this. You buy the 1 gallon plant, and in your head it's already 10 years old. And when you plant it, it's already there. People are like, what did you do? I'm like, just give it time. Only a handful of critics were that way. Just give it time. Just give it time. And I'm, obviously, certainly glad they did. All right, this is June 2005, about a year after opening. You can see the difference. I'll go back real quick. 2004, 2005. Just in 1 year, you can see the huge difference that in the garden still looks freshly planted. Right? Still looks very freshly planted. And a lot of times, this picture is what people have in their mind of a newly planted garden, not the 2004 picture. Right. So just give you an idea of how small the plant material was, and give you an idea of the commitment from the city, the commitment from Millennium Park Foundation, the commitment of the people that made Lurie Garden happen, in that whole just give it time concept. That was a year before we got to this. That was a year of probably every person that was involved, their phone ringing off the hook, people yelling and screaming at them about when is this garden going to grow in. That's stressful. That's a lot of commitment. That's a lot of commitment. All right, going to run through very briefly some ecological management concepts of Lurie Garden. So Lurie Garden is now 13 years on. How do we keep this thing that is Lurie Garden going? Well, we have weeds. We have the same problems everyone else does. We have weeds, bittercress and chickweed, common garden weeds. We fight these things all the time. We're no different than your average garden in many respects when we're dealing with issues of the garden. How we deal with them sometimes is a little bit different. All of the weeding in the garden is done almost exclusively by hand. So a lot of times gardeners have a tendency to go to the spray bottle to get some weed spray out, get some herbicide out. Or they pre-treat with different substances and such. They pre-treat their garden beds to minimize weeds. I think that's, what do they call it, some preen and stuff. They use that to pre-treat gardens so that weeds don't come up. Well, we don't do any of those sorts of things. Everything is done by hand and with the help of our volunteers. Constantly keeping an eye on that. We don't have huge weed issues. We have a handful of weeds that are a little problematic, but we don't have huge weed issues because, again, the garden is designed in a way that minimizes bare soil, so that minimizes the places where weeds occur. And actually, over the last year and a half or so, the head horticulturalist at the garden, Laura, and I have kind of been sort of informally keeping track of where we're pulling weeds from. We keep pulling weeds from the exact same spots every single time. It's like we know where the weeds are going to be. And so starting in the spring, one of the things we're going to do is when we pull those weeds in the spring, instead of just leaving that and letting the plant material try to grow in, we're just going to go ahead and throw a gallon plant in that spot. And try to fill those holes up even more. Even though we may dig that plant back up in the fall and move it somewhere else, but just to see if it'll work, we're just going to throw a gallon plant in there. Quackgrass. I hate quackgrass. This is the bane of my existence, the bane of everyone's existence at Lurie Garden. So quackgrass comes into the Lurie Garden as a tag-along on other plant materials, other grasses in particular that we plant, some panicums and things like that. It's come along as a tag-along. So it's in the garden, and it's always going to be in the garden. Our dreams of quackgrass free have been crushed. We've moved along. We're never going to get free of quackgrass. We're just moving on. We're in a control phase. We're not going to overcome the problem. So how do we control it? Well, we actually started experimenting with adapting the concept of prescribed fire, not a prescribed fire, but the concept of a prescribed fire to actually help control some of our more dense areas of quackgrass. So what we will do is in the very early spring, quackgrass is the first grass that comes up. So it's easy to tell what is quackgrass and what is not. We'll burn those areas and burn them repeatedly. So you burn and it forces a flush of growth. You burn and it forces a flush of growth. And what you're doing in the early spring by forcing the quackgrass to grow very quickly and to flush new growth is in essence, you're causing it to outgrow its nutrient reserves. So you in essence, you basically starve the plant to death. And so we've started to see a little bit of ground gained in this arena by doing this. Not a great deal, but we're still perfecting it. We're still, we're always looking for a little easier, a little bit more ecologically informed way to help control some of the things like weeds. This is one we've been experimenting with, and we're going to continue.
What are you burning it? What is that?
That's a handheld propane torch. So at the end of this is a little propane bottle that screws onto the end of it. Okay. How do we? Yes.
How many times do you do this burning to achieve it?
We'll burn the quackgrass up to 4 or 5 times this spring. Yeah, so basically once a week in the spring, more or less. So how do we control insects? We do not use any pesticides. We don't use any herbicides. We don't use any fertilizers and such. We don't use any of those chemicals in the garden. So how do we control pests in the garden, for instance, particularly aphids and mealybugs, common garden pests? We're not spraying. How do we control that? Well, we use integrated pest management. A part of that integrated pest management process is the release of predatory and parasitic insects. Here we're releasing green lacewing larvae that are in these cages. You remove this mesh on the back of them, sprinkle them into, for instance, they love living in the boxwood and the yew shrubs that surround the garden. So we'll open those up, shake those little larvae into the shrubs. And we actually then take these are little compostable cardboard frames. We'll just slide those underneath the shrubs because there's always a few that hang on inside of it. Slide those underneath the shrubs. And those green lacewing larvae will develop into green lacewings that are just devastating to particularly mealybugs. They'll also eat aphids, but they're high consumption predators of mealybugs and aphids. And it really helps. It does not eliminate them. We have a very high tolerance for mealybugs and a very high tolerance for aphids. So it doesn't eliminate them, but it controls them very nicely.
Who eats them?
Likely the bats and the birds in the garden. Most likely. Yeah. All right. We also release lady beetles, and these are the native species lady beetles, not the exotic Asian lady beetles that are most often sold for release. Right? These are we actually source the native lady beetles for release. They come in these big frames. There's, I don't know, probably 1 million plus in there. I mean, the sacks are huge that they come in. They're gigantic. And they're so cool. You pick up the freight, the little crate, you hold it next to you, and you can hear them. It's a little creepy. You hear them moving around in there and everything. It's really, really cool. But we'll sprinkle these throughout the garden at various areas, sprinkle these on the trees, and you'll just kind of disperse them around the garden. And again, aphids, mealybugs, primarily aphids, but they will also eat mealybugs. They help control those population levels to reasonably acceptable levels.
And do those last through the winter and come back the next
Yes, they will. Yes, not all of them. A lot of them will fly off because one of the great things about what we do at Lurie Garden with our insect releases is that a lot of the public lands around us don't do that. So they have really high populations of aphids and mealybugs and all these other things. So our insects, our predatory insects, get their fill in the garden and then fly across the street to the Art Institute or over to Maggie Daly Park or somewhere else and continue eating them. So Lurie Gardens actually become what we call in ecology a point of radiation or a spot of radiation where these insects actually disperse from the garden once they're done their job in the garden to other areas for benefits in other areas as well. We do have some locust trees in the garden, black locust trees, and they get honey locust spider mite occasionally. Right? They get honey locust spider mite because we have lots of honey locusts in the city. And so those will get spider mite and they'll jump from honey locust over to black locust with no problem. To control or help to control those spider mites, we actually release the spider mite predator, which is a mite itself. So we get this little shaker bottle filled with sawdust and living mite colonies, and then we go along to our trees and we sprinkle this on the trunks of our trees, and these predatory mites migrate into the canopies of the trees and actually consume the pest mites that are in the trees. And we couple this with a couple of different kinds of treatments. So we'll use organic horticultural oil in the early season to help control mite populations as well. But then once we release these, we stop those oil treatments and allow these to do the work. It never solves the problem, but it helps kind of mitigate. It helps keep populations as low as possible. Right? So our trees don't look perfect year-round, but that's one of the neat things about Lurie Garden is that it doesn't look neat and prim and proper year-round. So it allows us the ability to talk to people about what's going on and to improve their horticultural and gardening skills and provide to them alternatives to always spraying, always fertilizing, always wanting to make their gardens look prim and proper. Rabbits are a pretty significant nuisance. Well, we can't control rabbits as I learned to control rabbits when I was growing up in central Illinois, little rural community. We can't walk out there and create dinner, so to say. So we can't simply go out to the garden and do that. So we actually actively trap rabbits over the winter. Take them out to the western suburbs and give them to the western suburbs. And then to prevent those rabbits from doing things like girdling trees and And this is part of the shoulder hedge, so they get into the shoulder hedge and they'll girdle the trees in the winter for food sources and such. We actually put up exclusion fencing all around our shoulder hedge. So we exclude the rabbits and then trap the rabbits to remove the majority of the population, as opposed to any other control method. And it's been highly, highly effective. It's been quite effective for us. Right? So I did mention earlier that our garden is a 4-season garden. So in the fall and into the winter, our garden is up. It looks like this. Well, we can't leave it up year-round because the new plant material is going to regenerate at some point in the spring. So because we're a combination of this sort of ecologically informed public space, but also we're a work of art. We have to protect the artistic integrity of the garden. So we can't simply allow the new plant material to grow up through the old plant material. That would ruin the artistic integrity or the artistic vision for the space. So we have to make a compromise to that. And the compromise that we make is that leaving the garden up year-round means that people get to experience the beauty of the winter garden. Birds and other animals and insects get to feed off of the seed remnants in the garden all winter long. Overwintering insects have plenty of material to make homes to overwinter in, hollow stems of plant material and such. In the early spring, nesting birds, have plenty of material from the garden to collect to create nests. So all of these wonderful ecological and aesthetic things we maintain all year long. But then we have to cut the garden down at some point. It has to be cut down to allow the artistry of the fresh New Year's plant growth to really stand out. So in the fall and the winter, the garden may look like this. And then in the early spring, it goes through a moment of transition. And this is the one time that we really use, I guess you could say, that we use a chemical-powered something in the garden. It's the one time a year that we do. And it really is a labor question here. It doesn't have anything to do with ecology or horticultural science or anything. This is really just a flat-out labor question. So ground is still frozen in the very early spring. Ideally, there's no snow. So that very small window that we often get in Chicago can be as little as a day sometimes. So the ground is frozen, but there's no snow. We get a brush mower into the garden, set at about 6 or 8 inches in height, and we actually mulch the garden. We cut the garden down, leaving all that cut material in the garden. That provides two things. That provides mulch, because we don't use mulch really in the garden. That provides mulch to help do a little bit of weed suppression and such in the early spring. What it also does is it provides organic matter for the soil. So we have a very living, biologically active soil at Lurie Garden, and this helps feed that living, biologically active soil. This is the one time a year we get up in the garden and do this, and we actually will go through the day before we do this work, and we will flag off areas where we don't want the mulching mower to be run over. So there's some of the pinacetum grasses that have a nice big upright crown. We don't want the mower hitting those because they'll pull them out of the ground and kill the grass. We have a couple of small shrubs and trees and things like that in the garden. We want to make sure that we stay out of the root zones of those, so we prevent soil compaction. Even though the ground's frozen, we just want to play very conservative in that. So there'll be areas we have to hand cut afterwards. We come back in and we do hand cutting afterwards. But the majority of the work is done in this way. We do have a few plants that are problematic in the garden. So Rhizomedia, quaking grass, was actually a plant that was originally in the design for the garden. It's an ornamental grass, planted all over Europe in gardens and such. In Lurie Garden, in the Midwest, this became a highly invasive grass, aggressive, invasive. We have been trying to remove it for years, and it still pops up here and there. So we do a lot of the weeding that happens in the garden are things like this. Plant materials that have proven to be invasive or aggressive, and we are in the process of removing them. And that takes quite a bit of time. And then also things that you wouldn't think of. Eryngium yuccifolium, rattlesnake master, native, prairie, wonderful plant. We remove this plant by the wheelbarrow load from the garden. And because it is, again, we're balancing that concept of ecological purpose with artistry of the garden. Eryngium yuccifolium has a really bad reputation of being a heavy cedar. and all the seed germinate. So if left to its own devices, Lurie Garden could be, give it 5 years, it would be renamed Rattlesnake Master Garden. It would just be all over the place. And we have other plants like that too, compass plant, silphium, such, and some of the Asteraceae things would take over. And the garden would go from 222 different types of plants to 4. So we have to protect that ecological and artistic value, and we do that by actually weeding those plants out. Okay, so that was a little bit of the history, or a little bit of the concept of this design plant community idea, a little bit of history of Lurie Garden, and a little bit of the sort of behind the scenes peek of how we keep the Lurie Garden looking like the Lurie Garden. You can follow us on the web, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest. My email address is here. Happy to answer any questions that maybe follow up and such, but that's all of my information. Thank you all for having me out today. I really appreciate it.
We were out, a group of us went to Cardinal yesterday to pick up some plants, and he was telling us that in their field, they have to till everything under every 5 years to kind of rejuvenate the whole stock. And we've never done that in our gardens, so we were like, whoa, is that something that you guys do as well?
That is not anything we do. That is a plant production practice.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you're producing large quantities, almost monoculture type quantities of particular types of perennial plant material, you're going to want to do that, because that does a couple of things where it rejuvenates the soil for whatever's being planted next, and what it also does is it helps, in essence, like act as a crop rotation, or an element in crop rotation practices. So you wouldn't normally do it in a garden. We don't do this at Lurie Garden.
All right.
So.
Yeah, because he said it would stop, like your plants stop production after a while. We were like,
In a mass production setting,
All right.
absolutely. In a garden setting like this, or what you might have at home, then it won't.
you don't have to do that.
Yes.
When you cut down and mulch, do you also fertilize?
Nope, we use zero fertilizer in the garden. Our fertilizer is that organic matter that's going back into the garden. Yeah, yeah.
Do you have any problems with any fungus issues? I had a lot of that this year, even with my oak leaf hydrangea, which was kind of surprising. And I was recommended by the Chicago Botanical Garden to actually spray, but it hasn't killed it. I mean, I'm still dealing with it.
So it has been a horrible year for fungal diseases overall. Yeah, it's the weather, it's this weird cycle of rain and late season rain and humidity that we've been having. It's a horrible year for things like fungal and bacterial diseases. We do not see a significant impact from fungal or bacterial diseases in the garden. Occasionally we say, so our Joe Pye weeds, they'll get powdery mildew, but everybody's Joe Pye weeds get powdery mildew at some point. So we don't see anything out of the ordinary. And part of the reason that we don't is, I think it's one part of it is our practice of minimization of watering. So we do irrigate, we do water occasionally. Again, because we have to balance that idea of keeping the garden looking good because it's a work of art with the ecological impacts of water or no water. So we have to balance that. And we do water overhead, but we always water in the morning. We always water only when absolutely necessary. And even though the plant materials look incredibly dense, and they are, there is still actually more space, more sort of open nature for airflow in Lurie Garden than you would have in a traditional sort of mass garden or mass horticultural planting. So I think those things all combine to minimize issues with fungal outbreaks and such. And I can't really think of a time where we've had a really serious issue with that. I do know in general, though, this year has been particularly bad for that.
Do you do anything with butterflies?
Yes, so we have 3 species of milkweed. We have the common, we have butterfly weed, and we do have swamp milkweed, plus all of the supporting spring, summer, and fall nectaring plants as well. So we don't do anything specific with rearing or releasing, but we are, in essence, a butterfly sanctuary in that sense. Yes?
I'm fascinated by the use of insects to control other insects because of the weather. Like this year here was particularly bad, I thought, for mosquitoes and ticks. And I was wondering if there was any natural predators for the mosquitoes and the ticks, either insects or
Mosquitoes are easy. Dragonflies. Dragonflies and damselflies and bats are some of the best things that you can get for mosquitoes. And very often, mosquitoes at Lurie Garden, we have them. You will get mosquito bites, but you can actually get more mosquito bites in the rest of Millennium Park. I shouldn't say that. 'Cause I have to be careful now that I oversee Millennium Park. If you go to Maggie Daly Park, you'll get more mosquito bites. But because of the nature of the system that has been built in Lurie Garden, we have high populations of dragonflies and damselflies. We also see bats, birds, and such throughout the year in the garden as well. All of those things combine to keep all of the mosquito populations very low. We've never really seen issues with ticks or anything. I don't know if there are really any natural predators for ticks. That's one of the few insects that I just like. I think it's here and it has out-evolved any natural predator that it's ever had. But yeah, I don't know if there's any natural natural predator or natural parasite for ticks. But mosquitoes, certainly, anything you can do to draw bats and dragonflies into your garden is going to help great deal. Absolutely will not.